Hello and welcome to Macros with Mythili, where we take a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and challenges before the country. Well, one issue, apart of course from high inflation, that's hanging like a Damocles sword over the country's head, is the government's fiscal deficit. Key to containing the deficit is higher revenue or lower expenditure. But raising revenue is tough in a slowing economy, so the only option really is to cut expenditure. Hence the recent decision to appoint an Expenditure Management Commission headed by Dr Bimal Jalan. Will the Commission have anything new to say? Remember, we've had an Expenditure Management Commission in the past as well. It was called Expenditure Reforms Commission. More importantly, will the government listen to its advice? And who better to discuss this than two former secretaries in the Finance Ministry of the Government of India, Mr. E.A.S. Sarma and S. Narayan. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Mr. Sarma, if I may start with you. You know, the new management commission, the Expenditure Management Commission, it's called Expenditure Management Commission, as against the previous commission, which is called Expenditure Reforms Commission. Is the difference merely one of semantics, or is it that the government has really given up on reform, because that's much more difficult, and all it really wants to do now is try and manage expenses? So is there a difference, or am I reading too much into the difference in the name?
No, I do not think there is much of a difference. This is only a matter of words and semantics. What I feel is that the earlier commission headed by Mr. K.P. Krishnan, who was former finance secretary, did look at about 40 ministries. They suggested some downsizing, abolition of some departments, improvement of focusing of subsidies. Right now the fiscal system is under tremendous stress, and Dr. Bimal Jalan is the right person, very competent, because he was finance secretary. He was also governor RBI, and in one avatar, of course, he was also member of parliament. He is a very, very knowledgeable person. So I think it's very good that the government has appointed this commission. But I am more worried about the non-implementation of recommendations of K.P. Krishnan committee. And I think Dr. Bimal Jalan should look at it very carefully.
Absolutely. We'll look at whether the government will be able to implement a little later. But let me turn to Mr. Narayan now. So when you look at government expenditure, there's always this talk about the fact that the distinction between capital and revenue is very arbitrary, and one should look at expenditure overall. So is that distinction a little needless, or should one focus on revenue expenditure and cutting down revenue expenditure even while we allow capital expenditure to increase? So how should we look at expenditure, as one holistic thing or two separate heads?
Mythili, as you know, the concept of fiscal deficit itself in public finance is only about 20 years old. It's only in 1991-92 that the IMF started thinking about fiscal deficit as a serious matter in public finance, primarily because of the kind of distinctions you are making. Earlier, people used to worry only about revenue deficit, that is the government earning enough to meet its expenditure? But suddenly they found that, there's not enough money coming out for capital investments. And usually the argument was that capital investments could come out of market borrowings, and so long as the investments paid back at a rate higher than the market borrowings, and therefore it was okay to keep borrowing at that rate. But the moment revenue deficit started increasing, that means actually you are borrowing for revenue expenditure, and capital expenditure starts getting squeezed, then you are in serious trouble, and that is when the concept of fiscal deficit becomes so important. And if you look at the structure of the budget today, 5,40,000 crores is even this year's budget, the actual numbers of borrowing are higher than last year's. Last year were 5,10,000 or 5,30,000. This year you are borrowing 5,40,000. The reason the budget deficit appears smaller is because the denominator is a little bit larger, and therefore the deficit appears a little smaller in terms of the percentage. So in a way, the subsidies as well as the interest payments are actually eating into public finance substantially, and therefore Mr. Bimal is perhaps the best person to head this commission. In fact, he knows everything about government, having worked as CEA, having worked as finance secretary, having worked as governor Reserve Bank, and a very, very practical person whom I admire very, very greatly.
Mr. Sarma, if I can turn to you now. Mr. Narayan talked about how the revenue deficit is actually the more worrisome part of the fiscal deficit. But if you look at the revenue expenditure, then interest payments, account for the large bulk of it. They're the largest single head on the revenue expenses, followed closely by transfers to states and then by subsidies. Now, there's very little that you can do either about interest payments or about transfer to the states. But the only thing you can do something about is subsidies. But how easy is it to do anything about subsidies? You spoke about corporate subsidies, but corporate subsidies are only one part of it. We have food subsidies, oil subsidies, a whole host of subsidies. Which of these items in the subsidy list can one really prune down?
You see, when we talk of subsidies, we often confine ourselves to the subsidies on food, fertilizers, oil, and maybe some electricity. But we forget that almost about 500,000 crores is a subsidy, indirect subsidy given to corporates by way of revenue foregone. That's very important. Now, there is a link between corporate subsidies and this subsidy on oil, electricity and other items. I'll explain. For example, right now the electricity is being produced from natural gas, which is actually generated from Krishna Godavari basin. When you increase the price of natural gas, there is a corresponding increase in the price of electricity because the utilities are helpless. So this gets reflected as a subsidy given because the consumers cannot bear it, and domestic consumers cannot bear it. So there is a subsidy granted by the government to these utilities. So indirectly, this subsidy on electricity is really a subsidy given to the corporates producing gas. We are actually subsidizing their profits. So I think one should very clearly recognize that there is a very clear link between the two. Now I'll give the example of fertilizers. Now fertilizer subsidy is indirectly related to the subsidy. Indirectly, part of the subsidies go to the fertilizer companies. So it's very important to look at this. When you say subsidies should be reduced, it's become very fashionable for every government to say that we want to reduce subsidies. I think you must attack it at the root. I think even food grains, when it comes to that, you take Food Corporation of India. Now the inefficiencies of Food Corporation of India, they create a higher cost, unit cost, and that gets reflected as a subsidy on food grains. So basically what we should do is we should reform Food Corporation of India as far as food subsidies are concerned. Then fertilizers, I think fertilizer companies, there should be greater competition, greater efficiency, and gas price should be according to the production sharing contract and arm's length price, competitive price, not a high price which is highly subjectively decided by the Ministry of Petroleum and the Cabinet. I think this is a very important one. I think unless we look at these reforms, fundamental reforms, and then the second thing is the delivery systems. Most of the subsidy delivery systems are not subject to social audit. I think there is an independent audit of these delivery systems. I think to some extent we can target the subsidies and then we can improve the percentage of the benefits which reach the ultimate beneficiaries.
Mr. Narayan, Mr. Sharma is entirely right when he says that when by and large we talk about subsidies, we're always thinking in terms of food subsidies, fertilizer subsidy, oil subsidies, and the fact that we have large tax exemptions for corporates, what we call tax expenditure, largely goes under the radar. Would you agree that when one talks about subsidies, one needs to look at that also? Or can one take the view that, if you give subsidies to corporates, they create more employment, they create more jobs, and there's addition to national income. So one needs to look at them from a slightly different perspective.
I'd like to break this question up into three parts. The first, the food and fertilizer subsidies. Food subsidies are going to be here to stay. If the center doesn't give the subsidy, the states will. Several states are passing out food at zero cost or zero price, or passing out food at 1 rupee per kilo, etc. So food subsidies we'll have to learn to live with, I think, in this country. The political economy requires that food subsidy. The question is whether it comes out of the central budget or it comes out of the state budgets. That's the only question here. Fertilizer subsidies, certainly we should get away from subsidizing the producer to actually subsidizing the actual user, and therefore it requires targeting, and I do hope that the Aadhaar scheme and other measures will help us to do that, and I hope the Expenditure Commission recommends that this should be done, and I think this is something which is definitely feasible. Similarly, petroleum subsidies in terms of petrol oil, I think petrol and diesel, we should go as quickly as possible to market prices. Cooking gas, you can't do it yet because of the huge burden it will cast on the middle class. Therefore, other two can certainly be taken up, and therefore you can have a solution. The other point is the corporate subsidies. I would take the figure of this 5,40,000 crores which comes out in the budget as revenue foregone. and revenue foregone due to concessions given to different sectors. It could also be people who are manufacturing small items, etc., or it could also include places like, let us say, Uttaranchal subsidy, area subsidies, etc. I think it is very important to look at it very, very carefully to see how much of it can be cut down, and I think there is a great opportunity here. And if the Commission spends a little time on looking at revenue foregone, it would automatically come back to benefiting the expenditure side as well. So I do think that there is a great opportunity here.
Oh, well, great opportunity for the Expenditure Management Commission, but I'm afraid on that note we'll have to slip into a very short break, but please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the government's decision to appoint an Expenditure Management Commission. Mr. Sarma, we were speaking about subsidies just before we took the break. Now we've had 2 white papers on subsidies, and nothing much has changed. In fact, the papers keep talking about merit subsidy, non-merit subsidy. Are these matters of discretion? Is it very easy to identify which is merit, which is non-merit? And why is it that despite these 2 white papers, there's really been very little progress? In fact, subsidy as a percentage of GDP is still very high.
The subsidies we are talking of is about 2,30,000 crores, which is hardly 2% of the GDP. Now, you must know that when we talk of subsidy on petroleum products, we should know that the subsidy is a wrong word used, because the petroleum products are actually 40% of the price is because of taxation by the states and the center. So in a way, because of government's imprudence, fiscal imprudence, the government is taxing petroleum products heavily, and on the other side, they say that the oil companies are incurring under recoveries, so they want to subsidize. I think one has to look at this entire thing and see that if you really want to reduce the price of petroleum products and link it, bring it on par with the international price level, I think this taxation part of it is very, very heavy. I think that has to be looked at. Now, somehow these white papers which have been released and all, they don't address these fundamental aspects, the root causes. When you talk of these flagship programs, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme and all, I mean, not much of attention has been paid to, even though people, they're spending about 20,000 crores, 30,000 crores on National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, nobody is looking at the asset creation. I have personally collected information under Right Information Act. I went to villages, looked at the assets. Very often I found a tank is desilted under the NREGA and wages are paid to the workers. But the so-called tank, the desilting is a spurious one, because the area which is under the command of the tank has already got converted into a real estate area. Buildings are being constructed, so there is no irrigation at all. So what is happening is they are just pouring this money into wages without looking at the quality of assets. And similarly, social sector programs, they are giving a lot of money, Ministry of Social Justice, Ministry of Education and others, to a number of NGOs. But there is nowhere any evaluation of the background of the NGOs, where are they spending this money, what are the outcomes. And I remember I conducted at the time a surprise check, and I found many spurious NGOs. I think what is important is in all the social sector schemes, the beneficiaries must be rated. There must be a rating system, and then according to their rating, the government also should release. Otherwise, giving money like this, pouring money into spurious NGOs is not correct.
Mr. Narayan, Mr. Sharma talked about, how subsidies, there's so much of wastage in the subsidies, and he touched upon the fact that there's a great need for some kind of audit, some kind of monitoring, which brings us back to the fundamental question of targeting subsidies. Now, we've never had much success. What are the chances that we will have any more success now? Because the subsidy burden has only increased. It's well over 2% of our GDP at the moment.
If you are looking at cutting down the wasteful expenditure on schemes, I think it is very important to take the states along with you, because the implementation of most of these expenditure programs is done at the state level through state agencies and to state functionaries. If you don't do that, if you don't take the states along with you, then actually the only option left is to cut down the schemes and to make the schemes definitional, in the sense that, okay, we will give only for ABCD work and we will not give for BCD work. I do remember that earlier, just before the elections, while on electoral mode, the present Prime Minister was saying that we will make these schemes to be asset creative. We will make the schemes to be more targeted. I think that's an excellent way to go. If you are able to go in that direction and then able to tangibly see the results, and as Mr. Sarma points out, simultaneously carry out a social audit, there would be no objection. But if you have to continue the scheme as it is and to bring in a measure of audit without taking the state governments into account, I think it would be a little difficult. Again, we go back to the question of everywhere we go back to the question of implementation, and we go back to the question of political will for implementation. We keep going back to that same thing again and again.
Yes, we keep getting back to the first, back to square one, as it were. But Mr. Sharma, when you talked about, government salary structure, and you talked about the pay of government servants itself also being a big item in government's expenses, the fact is now we already have a 7th pay commission up and running. Given the fact that the 5th pay commission, the 6th pay commission, each of these commissions made a huge dent in government's financial position, what are the chances that we'll really be able to do something? Will the government really be able to resist that, that when the pay commission submits its recommendations, will the government be able to stand firm and say, look, our financial position does not permit it? Because if you remember, in the European countries, the first cut came on public sector salaries, government salaries, whereas in India, that's completely out of question. Government salaries are always protected, even though there is an indexation to inflation. So what are the chances that the 7th pay commission will again create complete havoc amongst government finances?
I would go back to the 5th pay commission. The 5th pay commission actually had 2 parts in it, report. The first part is about hiking the salaries. But the second part is more important, which actually talked of reforming the personnel side and improving their productivity and many incentives and disincentives. Now, the government ought to have adopted this report in its totality. Unfortunately, at the time, because of intense pressure from the unions, the government caved in, and they accepted the first part, which is really the salary hikes, and they jettisoned the second part, which is on reforms. Now, any price hike, in my view, should have a corresponding part in the pay commission report on reforming on the staff side, the salaries, incentive structure, disincentive structure. Now, it's very difficult for the government to, sack people, voluntary retirement schemes. They don't work in reality because of our politico-economic condition. A more acceptable thing would be to improve the productivity of the existing staff by redeploying them. And also, I think behind all this is a more basic issue. See, today the central government's role, what exactly is the role? They are very active in areas where the subjects belong to the states and the constitution. Now, the center's role, in my view, is basically in defense, foreign affairs. Now, the interventions must be more intense in some of the remote states like northeastern states, island states, or states which require help. And they should concentrate more and more on strengthening institutions rather than spending money. Very often the planning commission or the government, they measure the outcomes in terms of rupees. I think what is more important is they must try to strengthen institutions, regulators, and then allow those institutions to work rather than government spending money. Every rupee that goes out of the government's budget must be a reform rupee. So these are some of the things. I hope the 7th pay commission will look at this. Now the salary structure is fairly attractive, fairly remunerative for the employees, and I think their productivity, I think, is the most important. I hope Dr. Bimal Jalan will look at this aspect in greater detail, and I hope he will do something on this.
We will take a look at the government's finances and pay commission recommendations, likely pay commission recommendations, but shortly after a break. But till then, please do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and before the break we were just discussing the pay commission recommendations and how it should be taken in toto. Not only should there be pay hikes, but along with that there should be some rationalization of the staff structure also in the government. Mr. Narayan, if you look at the government's Expenditure Management Commission, the final report is expected before the budget 2016-17, whereas the pay commission recommendations are expected in August 2015. Now, how easy or how difficult will it be for the Expenditure Management Commission to really recommend anything meaningful as far as cutting expenditure is concerned, when you consider the 7th Pay Commission recommendations will have to be taken on board as well?
Actually, this is a very, very interesting point that you have raised, and I can see a lot of conflict here. and again 2 or 3 things. Firstly, to give the Expenditure Management Commission such a long time to submit its report gives the government that much less time to implement it. So if the report comes in by the end of August next year, by that time I would say the next budget will already be out. So that means 2 working years of this government are already gone before the Expenditure Management Commission report starts getting implemented. And certainly there will be pressure at the same time on the Pay Commission. Now the Pay Commission troubles actually started in 1996-97 when I would say a fairly weak government at that time yielded substantially to the pay increases that were recommended at that time, and then from there on there has been no looking back. Each Pay Commission has given something more. I think it's also time to look at the way in which government business is transacted. Is it necessary to have so many hierarchies starting at the lowest level, moving up a file right up to the Deputy Secretary, Joint Secretary and the higher levels in order to take decisions? We are seeing from a large number of issues which are coming out in the open, out of RTI, out of inquiries, out of the scams, etc., that the major decisions are always taken at the highest levels. So what is the rest of the organization doing? Is it all necessary? Can we learn from other countries where they have gone away from this method of working? So I think if even the Management Commission even points to alternatives of governance, alternative methods of doing administration, I think that would be a very big help. Maybe it will take 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, it doesn't matter. Even if it takes 10 years, if you are able to change the 100-year-old mindset of doing business, I think we'd go a very, very long way.
Mr. Sarma, one of the main problems really with government, fiscal data these days is that there's a great deal of questions are being asked about the integrity of the data. And key to that is the fact that government's expenses are on a cash basis. And there's been frequent demands, particularly from the Reserve Bank of India, that this must be shifted to an accrual basis, because only then will you get a complete picture of government's expenses, and scope for deferring expenditure year after year will not be there. How difficult is it, and was this ever considered when you were in government?
No, it was considered. In fact, I chaired the committee that drafted the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Bill. It became an act with some dilution, doesn't matter. Now, when we drafted this legislation, we did look at the possibility of introducing accrual system. Now, the problem is that the entire government budgeting is on cash basis. In fact, many countries, many advanced countries, this cash budgeting is common, it is in vogue. Now, accrual accounting is more, it's good to have accrual accounting, but it is not that easy. But we can adopt some of the good features, the positive features of accrual accounting, like contingent liabilities, and then asset, inventorization, and that kind of thing, we can introduce. Ultimately, it has to be a somewhat mixed kind of a thing.
Before we close, Mr. Narayan, a quick word from you on what can one hope as far as implementation of whatever recommendations the Commission makes.
I think we are at a stage where every recommendation of the Commission will be taken very seriously, primarily because public finance is fairly stressed now, and you cannot continue with capital formation or nation building if public finance continues to be stressed for a very long period to come. So I think every recommendation would be viewed seriously and implemented. The larger ones, which take a longer term, may take some more time to implement, but I think immediately, particularly on subsidies and particularly on control of wasteful expenditure, I think we'll see a lot of traction.
Mr. Sarma, any quick thoughts on how we can ensure implementations of the recommendations?
Implementation is always a problem, because once a report is submitted, that goes into the bureaucratic juggernaut, the whole thing gets processed and all. I think I would suggest to the new government that once Dr. Bimal Jalan's report is given, I think there should be a task force kind of thing in the Ministry of Finance. Actually, it should be located in the Ministry of Finance and at a fairly senior level, and they must take these recommendations one by one, and then they should they should monitor the implementation of these recommendations very closely.
So ultimately, it's all a question of implementation and political will. But I'm afraid on that note, we come to the end of this program. Thank you so much, Mr. Narayan and Mr. Sarma, for joining us in this very interesting discussion. Thank you also for watching Macros with Mythili. But we'll be back next week, same time, with yet another edition. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.